Hi, I'm Colin Walls, and I'm here again to talk about embedded software. Well, actually today, I'm not so much going to talk about software as talk about the job of an embedded software engineer. Now, I don't know whether you've had the same problem as me, but explaining what I do, what embedded systems are all about, is actually quite challenging. It's something that not everybody really understands, the ins and outs of how we spend our time. And if you imagine you're in a bar somewhere and you're chatting with somebody and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" And you say, "I'm an embedded software engineer." Now, assuming the conversation doesn't just come to a halt at that point, you'll probably get into quite a complex discussion about how you spend your time. My best advice to you there actually is just make up something different. Say you're an airline pilot or a drug dealer or something, because that will make the conversation much simpler from then onwards. However, more seriously, if we do think about what embedded software engineers do, we would normally say, oh well, we design and write embedded code. And indeed, that's what software engineers are trained to do. The primary education is all about writing, or designing and writing code. However, in the real world, it doesn't work like that. Whilst we do spend time doing both those activities, a lot of an engineer's time is spent debugging code, because code is very rarely bug-free, let's be honest, or maintaining code, because code is written once but is quite likely to need to respond to changing requirements over time. So a lot of time is spent debugging and maintaining code. So when we're writing code, that's what we should be thinking about. We shouldn't be thinking necessarily about writing the most efficient code, because actually the compiler will take care of most of that. A modern compiler will generate excellent code, almost whatever you give it. So your focus must always be the human reader, who's going to look at your code later on and carry out debugging and maintenance on it. Because actually it might be you. So it's in your interest to do that work. I'm giving some thought as to how to write highly debuggable, maintainable code. And there's no simple guidelines here. But I thought of 6 primary points to take into account. This is a non-exhaustive list, but it gives you some ideas. So we start off. First thing, structure your code in as simple a way as possible. Do not use long, complex conditional sequences and so forth. They're hard to follow and quite unnecessary. Do a series of ifs rather than a nested complex structure. Next one is keep expressions and hence statements in a language like C as short and simple as possible. Long complex expressions make it look like you're really smart, but actually are impossible to read. It's best to break it down into a series of simple expressions. It won't be any less efficient. Just write it in a way the human reader can understand those expressions. Next one, comment your code. Doesn't mean comment every single line. It just means put in guidance as to what the code is doing, why it's doing it, what variables are used for, and so forth. The next thing is more subtle, and that is, don't assume the reader is as smart as you are, or certainly don't assume they're smarter than you are. Don't assume they're really an expert in the language which you're writing. Best example of that is operator precedence in C. Everybody knows, I hope everybody knows, that say multiply has higher precedence than add. But some of the other operators, it's not totally clear which has precedence over the others. If you have the slightest doubt in your brain, don't look it up. Leave the manual on the shelf. Just put in parentheses to make sure the code is clear. Because the person reading the code would probably have the same doubt as you. So make sure you're writing the code not for idiots, but for somebody who's not an expert. The fifth thing is use names for identifiers that make sense. Don't say X, Y, and Z when you actually could describe what those things are. So X and Y might mean horizontal position and vertical position, in which case give them names like that. And lastly, consider adding a few more comments, because you can almost not have too many comments. That's a sweeping generalization, but it's worthwhile reading your code and making sure that what you've written is understandable and adding some extra comments if you have the slightest doubt. The way I always approach this is to write the code, then look at it a few days later, and if it still makes sense to me, well, maybe I've done the right job. If it doesn't make 100% sense, I think it through carefully and add an extra comment or two so that next time I come back to it I'm okay. So this is a non-exhaustive list of things you can do to make your code better for maintenance and debugging. That's it for this time. I'll be back again soon on another topic of embedded software. So, bye for now.